It's my great privilege to introduce Michael Lenz. Mike and I have known each other for, I think we just said over 10 years, which made us feel older than we wanted to. In that short time, he's launched a very impressive career. He is an associate professor and director of the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA, where he and his team work on issues related to housing policy and equity. His work is at the intersection of academic research and public policy and practice. Topics include, among others, housing subsidies, tenant protection, evictions, schools, and more. Today, he's going to tell us whether, in fact, single-family housing is indeed on the way out. And as a special note, Michael is on sabbatical right now, and he has flown all the way from London to be with us. So we appreciate that. Let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. Thank you to the entire Kriesman family for the generous support that helps us be here today. Thank you to the Mansueto Institute and Emily, Professor Talon, for inviting me. And you know, it's a really special pleasure for me to be able to speak to you today and learn from all of you today. It's been a pretty long time since I have spoken in person in front of any group anywhere. As Dan mentioned, I'm on sabbatical. This is, this is not something I'm doing these days, and that's, great for me. But I miss things like this, obviously, as we all do. And I'm a little rusty, but I'm extremely excited. And continue to eat, enjoy yourselves, and listen when you have the spare ear. The University of Chicago is quite the place for me to kind of make a comeback in terms of speaking in person, but Chicago itself is also a very special place for me. Around 80 years ago, my grandparents were part of the Great Migration, and in their case, that brought them on a very well-worn path from Mississippi to Chicago. And they settled here and they raised 9 children, including my father. My family did not always have an easy time in Chicago, but this has always been a second home for me. Chicago was a difficult destination for Black migrants for several reasons, but housing discrimination, of course, was a central one, and we've talked about that obviously today to some extent. Chicago was not unique in this respect, but the explosive growth in the Black population here and obviously made the impacts of discrimination widely felt, and this university has and universities elsewhere, of course, and people elsewhere, scholars elsewhere, have studied housing discrimination in Chicago extensively and the segregated environments and concentrated disadvantage that would result. So the crises of housing and race in Chicago are very widely felt. They're very well studied and well understood and well documented. But what do these old fights about racial discrimination in housing have to do with single-family zoning, which is the topic of what brings us here today? The simplest answer to that question is that single-family zoning is one of those pernicious policies that is racially neutral in word, but has very racist and classist origins, as we've discussed, and continues to have disparate impacts on racial minorities, people with lower incomes, and the communities where they reside. American cities have used many methods to segregate, and low-density zoning is undoubtedly one of those. In some ways, the story begins in 1917 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that cities could not create explicitly racial zones, but then, less than a decade later, it gave cities wide leeway to zone for various land uses. In 1948, the court ruled that the enforcement of racial covenants, or ruled against the enforcement of racial covenants. Yana showed us incredible maps of the use of these covenants in Minneapolis this morning. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act made methods such as discrimination by lenders, brokers, and sellers face more scrutiny. And urban renewal and segregating highway construction fell out of favor by the 1970s. Also in that decade, the country, for better or worse, stopped building largely segregated public housing developments in largely segregated neighborhoods. But low-density housing endures. and has always been used as complements to these more explicitly racially discriminatory methods. And they're complements that create and maintain segregated residential environments. Now, it is true that the earliest beginnings of zoning in the US came before the Great Migration took off in earnest. And while this is unknowable, it is likely that zoning would be ubiquitous and would exist in some form, even if Blacks had never moved to cities in large numbers. But there's substantial evidence that zoning took the form that it did and has been practiced as it has, in large part due to the goal of excluding Black Americans from places desired by whites. And we can make these claims for several reasons. First, explicitly racial zoning first proliferated in southern US cities when Blacks lived in those cities in considerably larger number than in the North. In several cases, Northern planners, in fact, were brought in to craft updates to these ordinances after the court ruled against racial zoning. The sheer volume of racially explicit ordinances that were created before they were deemed unconstitutional suggests that only the naive among us would assume that future zoning policies would be racially neutral in goal and outcome and have nothing to do with these racially explicit goals. Second, racial covenants which restricted property owners from selling to Blacks were widespread, but faced a collective action problem. These covenants showed that there was a large number of real estate brokers and property buyers and sellers who were very well motivated to maintain neighborhood racial purity, but this required Herculean feats of organization and the cooperation of individual homeowners. Zoning was one solution to this collective action problem. In the court's opinion upholding the constitutionality of zoning, to be clear, not something I really disagree with, they explicitly lambasted apartments as parasites on single-family neighborhoods. That part I very much disagree with. This enshrined into law a pejorative opinion of homes that deviate from the single-family norm, and this is an opinion that is deeply embedded in the American psyche. This bias against multifamily housing is deeply intertwined with bias against the poor and racial minorities in at least two ways. First, again, bans on multifamily housing have racist origins. Recent research uses historical zoning maps and data on race to make this case in new ways. Alexander Son uses variation in Black migration rates to show that cities implemented stricter zoning prohibitions as Blacks were moving to these cities in larger numbers. Second, cities across the country have always tended to zone white neighborhoods as single family much more often than integrated or Black ones. Allison Schertzer and colleagues look here in Chicago and show that higher residential density was pushed into areas with a higher share of Blacks. In other words, there were single-family zones for white neighborhoods and something else for everywhere else. In a follow-up paper, they also found that these zoning decisions entrenched and intensified racial segregation in Chicago for decades beyond. But this is all old stuff, right? Sure, there's all of this evidence that single-family zoning and other restrictions on density had racist origins. That's bad. But what are the connections that matter today that are still playing out, particularly with respect to single-family zoning? While single-family zoning does not explicitly discriminate against particular people, it does obviously discriminate against a particular type of housing. And given low-income people and people of color are less able to afford single-family homes, discriminating against other housing types has disparate impacts on them. In the metropolitan US, only 10% of households in detached single-family homes are poor, compared to close to 30% in multifamily units. And most of the poor households in single-family homes are homeowners. They're not renters. In total, only 4% of detached single-family homes in the US are occupied by renters whose household incomes are below $25,000. The homeownership gap between Black and white households is well discussed and well understood, and this gap is effectively replicated when we look at housing type. 67% of whites live in single-family housing compared to 48% of blacks. And it is important to note that single-family zoning is not the only way that local governments restrict the types of housing that can be built in a particular place. There are countless tedious zoning things, right? Single-family zoning tells us how many units can be on a parcel, but zoning also governs building shape, height, width, or depth. Minimum setback requirements govern how far back a building must be set back from a property line. Floor to area ratios are another way of making sure there is not too much built area for the amount of open space. Minimum lot sizes make it so we cannot cut up a city into too many parcels. And we have minimum parking requirements that make sure we have a place for cars to sleep and drive up the cost of housing by driving down the amount of land we can devote for people to sleep. These laws make it harder for more housing to be built in more places. Land is always scarce where people want to live, and all of this makes land for housing even scarcer. And that makes multifamily housing in particular hard to build. When people talk about upzoning, they may be talking about addressing any of these density restrictions that I just mentioned. And single-family zoning has often been used in concert with the others. But single-family zoning, of course, is the one thing that bans apartments outright. Appropriately, this is getting a lot of attention, even in an all-day symposium at the University of Chicago. So let's talk more about this, single-family zoning. One thing that is worth noting off the bat is that the US is a big outlier here. Lots of similar countries have similar homeownership rates, but much lower shares of land where only single-family homes can be built. This tells us it's not all about some kind of homeownership ideal that has been well discussed in this country. And it's not just because we have a lot of land. San Francisco is basically landlocked and sets aside over 1/3 of its residential space for single-family homes. Along with San Francisco, I would count Boston, New York, and Washington, along with Chicago as, at least off the top of my head when I wrote this, about 5 US cities where you usually think of someone living in something other than a detached single-family home. Here in Chicago, our friend Steven has told us some of this data, but this is where I got this data, and here the man is. Cool. Calculated that about 41% of Chicago is a single-family only zone, and about 21% of the city allows multifamily residential. But of course, only some of this is residential space wherever you look. And so if you just look at the amount of residential space that Chicago has, 66% of that area bans multifamily housing. So about 2/3 of the residential space is a single-family only zone. These numbers out of Chicago tell us just how out of whack or how weird the US is. When you look at a city like Chicago, one of the great global cities of our country, that still has so much land devoted to single-family only. So if the ubiquity of the single-family detached home is indeed due in large part to zoning and not just preferences, which Professor Talon opened that discussion right away this morning, then government policy bears responsibility for any negative effects that arise from the single-family home. So single-family zone, so what are those effects, right? So single-family zoning has racist and classist origins and effects, and we use a lot of it compared to other countries. What are some of these tangible reasons why we should maybe do something about it, other than those other things, which are obviously important? The first thing is that it forces people to buy more housing than they might otherwise. All else equal, most of us are totally cool with living in big houses and, having big yards, right? And not smaller ones. But those spaces are expensive. And a lot of people are actually quite happy and would prefer to live in smaller homes and spend that money elsewhere. We all have, consumption decisions and limits. Second, forcing people to buy large housing affects urban form and the environment. We take up more space from fewer people and encroach on wildlife habitats. And low density living is intertwined with our car-dominated transportation systems that pollute our air and contribute to climate change. Third, even if the origins of single-family zoning had nothing to do with race or class, it makes it less likely that non-white people and low-income families can live in these single-family neighborhoods. This exacerbates segregation. And what's worse is that the places with the greatest neighborhood attributes, places with strong schools, low crime rates, better access to jobs, parks, and other amenities, are almost always zoned single-family. So the places where we want people to live and gain access to various opportunities exclude them from doing so. Moving people to opportunities is generally a lot easier than moving opportunities to people. So letting more people live in the most prosperous and amenity-rich neighborhoods of our urban areas would dramatically increase well-being. While single-family zoning is not the only way cities can and do exclude, it is the easiest and most prevalent. So while we need to do a lot of other things, single-family zoning is often the tail that wags the planning dog. When we treat 60 to 90% of a city's residential land as sacrosanct and untouchable, we close the door on countless important planning and development conversations. And again, I will easily admit that ending single-family zoning is not the only or even most important possible planning reform. But we can't let people argue us into this box. Ending single-family zoning will not solve segregation, exclusion, or housing affordability. It is a classic, necessary, but insufficient change. The politics are also super hard, and single-family zoning will absolutely not just go away everywhere overnight. But the first step is that we, as a community of planners and urban scholars, have to be in agreement that the single-family zone should not exist. There are a lot of arguments against this position. Some are pretty good, mostly. Some. Let's talk about the good ones. A common one is that people, especially Americans, they just want to live in single-family homes. So why do you want to take away their freedoms? While these preferences may be real, taking away single-family zoning does not take away single-family homes. Single-family zoning is a ban on apartments. Taking away single-family zoning is not a ban on single-family homes at all. Miraculously, those who have convinced cities and homeowners to rigidly constrain what can and cannot be built have framed these restrictions as protecting people's freedoms. Somehow it is a right of property owners to restrict what all the other surrounding property owners can and cannot do with their property, just so they can freeze their neighborhoods in amber. It's pretty wild when you think about it. But back to preferences. If you get rid of single-family zoning where everybody wants a single-family home, nothing will change because nobody will build apartments. Where single-family zoning is harmless, it is unnecessary. But where it is necessary, it is quite harmful. Another concern is that people see promoting density as a market-based solution. And a very valid concern is that market-based solutions to housing people have exploited the poor and people of color. This is a tricky one. The fairest thing to do would be to upzone places with a low presence of low-income folks and people of color. But we also know that any processes to upzone cities will disproportionately be dictated or at least influenced by those with more power. So this is really hard to make happen. But housing is going to be a market-based good in this country for the foreseeable future. And taking the market out of housing doesn't exactly have a great track record in other countries, even if I think, very strongly that that US governments at various levels should spend a lot more on subsidizing housing than it does. So we do need the market to produce more homes for more people. Housing is a good thing. We need to act like it is. A related concern is that allowing more development in cities will make housing more expensive. People often have this on its head. There's no doubt that more housing in a city is necessary to keep costs from rising out of control. There's a lot of research on this. Housing markets are not, I'm not saying that they're not as straightforward as most markets, but supply is still an important ingredient to make housing affordable. And zoning clearly matters to make housing more or less abundant. Right now, I think it's important that we better understand the specific pathways through which zoning limits housing supply so we know what to change. In this vein, in recent research, Michael Manville and Paavo Makkonen and I have tested a few different zoning mechanisms. And the short of it is that zone capacity really matters, especially in high demand cities. So, what's zone capacity? Simple way of thinking about this is that a lot that's zoned single family has a zone capacity of one unit. If you're zoned for a duplex, you have a zone capacity of 2. When places have high demand, they tend to limit their zone capacity. And when they limit that zone capacity, it really suppresses housing production. A trickier question is whether housing development in lower income neighborhoods might encourage higher income people to move in and attract more development and amenities. The evidence on this is certainly less conclusive. But not building homes in lower income neighborhoods can contribute to displacement as well. If people with more money want to live in these neighborhoods and we do not build homes for them, landlords will be happy to move on from their current tenants and make more money on the people that have it. And again, poor renters are a very small number of people living in single-family housing. When cities prohibit development in amenity-rich neighborhoods, furthermore, housing demand does not disappear. It moves to other neighborhoods where it may fuel gentrification and displacement, and into the urban fringe, resulting in longer commutes, greater emissions, less open space. People who care about gentrification pressures in low-income neighborhoods should advocate for upzoning somewhere, if not in those specific neighborhoods. A related thing that people worry about is evictions of renters of single-family homes. This is not a concern unique to upzoning single-family neighborhoods. It is a concern about upzoning, period. But if the presence of renters makes upzoning single-family problematic, then it must make upzoning multifamily neighborhoods even more problematic because that's where the renters live, and it's particularly the poorer renters. If cities worry that upzoning will harm renters, then they should upzone the places where the renters are least likely to live, and that's single-family neighborhoods. Some people will say, I like the way my neighborhood looks with lawns and low density, and that's an aesthetic preference, right? And there are plenty of neighborhoods that look like that where you can live. To me, buying a home does not purchase a right to dictate your neighborhood's future form. But we essentially practice planning in the US as if it does. And aesthetics are in the eye of the beholder. Paris is really beautiful. There are basically no single-family homes there. Related, we can't really just recreate Paris, okay? You got me. Related is that people fear massive towers in their neighborhoods if you upzone. This is an argument against tall buildings, not for single-family zoning. There are many, many options in between. And we talked about missing middle already today. And tall buildings are at least partly a response to the scarcity of land where anything but a single-family home can be built. When development can occur only on a small share of land, there's more pressure to intensively build on those parcels and build big towers. Another argument is that people think that single-family neighborhoods are good for promoting homeownership, raising families, and good citizens. There's basically no evidence that kids thrive better in single-family neighborhoods, all else equal. And the social benefits to homeownership are also rather unproven. You'll hear some concerns about infrastructure. Simply, yes, we have an infrastructure problem in this country, but we should fix the infrastructure instead of breaking the housing system. For example, people worry that densifying single-family neighborhoods that are not well connected or served by transit might be bad for the environment if the transit does not exist to serve it. Okay, the US has bad transportation systems. Make them better. Build more of them. Use congestion pricing. Get rid of parking requirements. Stop subsidizing driving. But we cannot layer housing crises on top of transportation crises. The same applies to schools, sewers, roads, and the like. Some of the pushback we've gotten on ending single-family zoning worry about abolishing it everywhere at once. That such a change may be too chaotic. I don't really worry that that's going to happen, would be my first response. At the end of the day, I think anyone who analyzes this issue in a serious way is likely to come to the conclusion that such a zone is pretty silly and it's unjust, so we have to say so. We don't have to say end it everywhere now. I think that would be pointless because that's not the fight I think we're likely to fight. But some do worry that this is the wrong battle to fight, even jurisdiction by jurisdiction. And I do think that it is jurisdiction specific in terms of what you want to say and where you think you're going to get to. Or in some places, you could start the negotiations with, we must abolish single-family zoning, and maybe you get more actionable benefits after you scare everyone senseless. This points us to other policies. Are there a bunch of other things we should be doing instead? I will say again that several other zoning reforms are just as important as ending single-family zoning. We need to be careful not to overpromise, right? Ending single-family zoning and doing nothing else probably will not add to the housing stock much at all in most places. And overpromising will disappoint your allies and galvanize your opposition. But housing policy is not just zoning. I'm just an academic, so I'm more useful at standing up here and complaining about things rather than telling you exactly how to solve it. But I do know that zoning interacts with housing policy in really important ways. We can give people more money to pay for housing, and we should. Housing vouchers are incredibly important, as an example. But expanding a program like that will only go so far if we don't increase the number of homes for people to use these vouchers. Single-family homes, again, are not typically rented. If that's most of the stock, there are not a lot of places to use vouchers. Lots of people love rent control. Rent control can be an important tool. But with rent control without housing production can make housing really expensive for everyone who does not get the golden ticket of rent control. Inclusionary zoning is also popular. That becomes a whole lot less inclusionary when there is little housing being built. You can't include affordable housing into something that doesn't exist. So where has there been action on ending single-family zoning and other housing restrictions, and is it working? Again, I'm just an academic, so about the is it working part, I say, well, it's too early. We need more data. It depends. I'm not ready to answer all of these questions just yet. And the question of progress usually starts as our day in Minneapolis, right? We had an incredible look from Jana about the promising changes and challenges there this morning. The very, very early evidence there is that rents are holding steady or even dropping, while I've seen some work that shows that property values are rising. If that holds, that seems pretty good, right? When we got this weird system where we want homeowners to have their stuff get more expensive and renters to have their stuff get less expensive. If that happens, okay, we're winning. Again, it's early. It's early. And we will probably hear from other jurisdictions. I know that Sarah Bronin and others will discuss things going on in the Northeast this afternoon. From what I've been monitoring from London, I'm not monitoring really all that much except for my own needs. But when I do take a peek back at the U.S. zoning and policy story, a lot of the activity seems to be at the state level. And I think you can put this into about 4 buckets. The first bucket of activity is states directly changing the substance of zoning rules at the local level. The clearest example here is Oregon ending single-family zoning with HB 2001. A second area of state preemption is states changing how rezonings have to occur, how that process has to be. And an example here is Massachusetts, where they lowered the needed vote thresholds for rezonings with H 5250. A third area of activity is giving localities mandates or incentives to plan. States can provide funds or other carrots or even mandates to engage in planning reforms through a deliberative process. Utah is attempting to reform housing and land use element standards with SB 34. The fourth bucket tries to directly address segregation through fair share housing allocation changes. This is well exemplified by my usual home state of California, where the regional housing needs assessment process has been reformed to try to allow the state to exert more influence over the amount of homes that its jurisdictions plan for. California effectively made the affirmatively furthering fair housing mandate. That's maybe the fastest I've ever rolled that out. I'm really proud. Got a dry mouth at this point. Like, that was good. Thank you. From the Obama administration, this is the one that was semi-famously, at least in our circles, rescinded by Trump and then reinstated in some form by Biden. California basically made affirmatively furthering fair housing, there we go, state law. At UCLA, we're studying these processes and outcomes in California, and it's been bumpy, to be honest. Cities are creative in resisting these mandates, and the state is struggling with how to define and demand clear thresholds that hold cities accountable. But again, it's early, and it is still a promising framework. You could also argue that California has abolished the single-family zone already, since you can build an accessory dwelling unit on any lot. This adds housing kind of at a trickle, but it still adds housing. My wife and I are building an ADU, but it's really just so our kids have a place to make loud video game noises that's not right near us. So we're not adding housing. We're just taking advantage of the rules. Sorry. And extremely hot off the presses, Sarah here, gave me a heads up on this, that the White House today announced that they are going to reward jurisdictions for zoning changes. Devil's in the details. Let's not, get too excited, but the holy grail of this has been tying zoning changes to transportation dollars. And it seems like that might be where they're trying to head. Ask Sarah for more details. I don't know as much as she does for sure. Okay. We've all eaten. I've gone on long enough. I'm going to wrap this up. Removing single-family zones block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, city by city will not solve our nation's housing problems or our racial justice problems. But planners and scholars have a responsibility to inform the public where single-family zoning came from and the problems that it creates. This should also open a conversation about housing. Too often, conversations about housing concern what could go wrong. It might congest roads. There might be shadows. The beginning and end about conversations about housing should be that we all require it and that we need more of it. Housing has social value, and history shows that when cities let people build it, they get more neighbors, more opportunity, and skies that do not fall. Housing is good. We rarely talk and act like it is, and we should. Thank you. What I can say about that is, think about the flip side, which would be Los Angeles. So you have 50 aldermen in Chicago. Let's consider Chicago and Los Angeles to be roughly the same population, just for math's sake. There's 14 in Los Angeles, which means that each of those city council members, we call them, still use alderman? Ooh. Excellent. Okay. Slightly overdue, but okay. 14. So then the population in the land area, per person ends up being quite large and unruly. The way that it works there, though, is that all of the major major and minor, a variance in in a council district basically gets a 14-0 vote every time, right? So like, you don't vote against what I want in my district, and I won't vote against what you want in your district. So it's not 26 to 20, 24. Yeah. So it's 14. You got to get 14-0, really. And so what at the end of the day, what it means is like, if the city council person in the district where the thing is happening doesn't want it, it doesn't happen, and everybody votes against it. Yeah. Well, I don't think. There's no way that I would ever say that, density equals social justice. But I think you're also cherry picking some counter examples, right? Like, yeah, the Gold Coast of Chicago, expensive. Coastal Miami properties, very expensive, sure. But how many suburban subdivisions could we find in the United States where, the cost of entry is way above the metropolitan median, right? Our most expensive real estate is undoubtedly our single family real estate. Whatever city you go to other than like New York City, which is obviously a crazy outlier because everywhere in Manhattan is, building. Yeah. But so I think like it is much easier to find it's much harder to find the counterexamples that you're talking about than the single family, the just bland single family neighborhood that costs a whole lot of money and not a lot of people live in. And so, I mean, it is, but that I think I agree largely, I agree with much more than I disagree of what you said, because it's a lot more complicated than just, density in a particular place. I think what I would always strongly advocate for is opening neighborhoods where there are more amenities, where the cost of living is already quite high, to multifamily development, because if you don't, the cost of entry to those neighborhoods is much higher.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really great.
Thanks.
You at the end you ended your presentation with, housing is great. We want more housing. We need more housing. And you stopped short of saying housing is a right, which I'm not asking you to say that, but I mean, and that's like me projecting my own beliefs. But I'm wondering, do you see a connection between having more of a rights-based discourse around housing and like what the effects of that could be on our conversation around zoning? And can you think of like maybe examples where certain municipalities have adopted, the idea of housing as a right, and if that's had implications for the conversation on zoning? Or can you just speak to the relationship between those two at all?
I have lots of thoughts on this, and I'll try to not go too far. Mainly because I just read and reviewed so I'm a professor, so I'm going to say there's a book. Casey Dawkins at the University of Maryland just wrote a book called Just Housing. And this is really the central question of that entire book. And I think, one of the things I took away is that like the conversation about when we put I don't want to call it a tagline, it's deeper than that. But when we put a phrase like housing is a human right front and center, I don't think we've done a great job of defining what that right is, what that right, what is a right to what kind of housing? Like, is that a right to shelter? Is that an obligation on the behalf of society or the public to reduce housing inequality? By how much, So I think it's hard to operationalize housing as a human right. And I think, I think it does, there's going to be plenty of people that probably disagree, right? Like I think we have also fallen short of specifying what it is about housing that's special and unique, and what in American kind of what in the American political and legal tradition like substantiates that claim, right? Because like we can say a lot of things are a human right, and there's a lot of things that we want people to have, and so that's of course the professor answer, and it's much less grounded, I think, than your question was getting to. And I guess the short answer to like, do I know places that are really going somewhere interesting with kind of changing that conversation? No, I don't. But I think I'm really excited about that question because I think it is really important because there's a lot of movements that, are doing amazing work and they use that language. And I am now kind of thinking, well, who is and is not convinced by that? And how do we make that more specific?
Thank you, Michael, for everything,
over
for
there.
your talk. I'm sorry, I'm right over here.
Thank you.